So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to an unaccustomed location and an unaccustomed time of day. But of course, BEREC, we always care about our stakeholders, and one of our stakeholders was having a conference today, so we wanted to avoid too much of a clash, and I think we also were participating there. So thank you very much for coming. On our panel today, we have Bo Anderson from PTS, Teresa from ComReg, Dan, the incoming chair, soon to be chair of BEREC, also from PTS, myself and Tom Boyce, and Laszlo is in Riga today, but he's I think available by video. So do you want to say hello, Laszlo? So in terms of the agenda, just to kind of give you some highlights. So we have two Christmas presents for our stakeholders in terms of consultations, but we have allowed a little bit of extra time for response so that to take account of the Christmas period. So we have some draft BEREC guidelines on assessing the effectiveness of public warning systems transmitted by various different means, and a draft BEREC report on member states' best practices in support of the defining of adequate broadband, particularly in the context of USO. And Teresa from the End Users Working Group will talk about that in due course. We have two sets of guidelines which are finalised, have been adopted, and we're publishing. One is on the minimum criteria for a reference offer, and the other is on guidelines for the notification template for general authorisations. There are a number of other publications. So there's the BEREC Work Programme 2020, which Dan will present. We have a report on the collection of data from both authorised undertakings and OTTs, looking at which aspects of that might be conveniently done in a coordinated and harmonised manner. Then we have a report which Bo will talk about. So you'll recall we had this Pathfinder project to look at all the regulatory aspects apart from spectrum that would be important in enabling innovation in the 5G ecosystem, and also to look at any aspects in which 5G might affect other parts of regulation. So there's been we did a call for inputs earlier in the year. We're today publishing a report on the outcome of that call for inputs, and then seeking some further input on how issues might be prioritised and on whether or not there's anything missing even now. Then we're also publishing, it won't be today, it'll be in a few days' time, it's just being finalised, a report on the study of determinants of investment in very high capacity networks, but I'll give you a flavour of some of the main findings from that report. And then there's some other reports on termination rates, on roaming, and on regulatory accounting in practice. And then finally, we're also publishing today summaries of 3 internal workshops that we have done. So these are workshops, the main purpose of which is to enable experts from NRAs to share experience. But we think, again, for transparency, we'll publish a summary of what was discussed at those workshops. So those are on the migration from copper to VHCN, on margin squeezes, and on fraud and misuse. And then finally, I will talk a little bit, there's a couple of other things. We're publishing a summary of the BEREC Stakeholder Forum, which of course many of you were at, and we have signed a memorandum of understanding, or really renewed our memorandum of understanding with Regulatel, which is the network of regulators from Latin America and some other Spanish-speaking countries in Europe. Sorry, I'm going to get some water. So I will run through most of the reports before asking Teresa, Bo, and Dan to talk about the specific ones. So the first of the reports are a set of draft guidelines, so these are published for consultation. And this is to do with public warning systems being deployed, so sometimes known as reverse 112. So in the kind of historically, if there was some emergency, there would be a TV broadcast, a radio broadcast, klaxons, all sorts of things. There's now, of course, the possibility to use, and under the code, people will be required to use some other types of system. And one system that can be used involves cell broadcast or SMS, and there's a standard for that. But there's the possibility for countries, for member states, to choose alternative forms such as applications. And the BEREC guidelines are, but if they choose something else, the member state has to ensure it has an equivalent performance to at least as good as the cell broadcast and SMS-based systems. So we're publishing some guidelines for the for how member states would carry out that assessment, and the public consultation is running until the 31st of January. So we've changed the date to again give a little bit more time. For that. The next one is the guidelines on the minimum criteria for a reference offer. So these are now finalised. I don't think there's anything very much surprising in these. We've kind of we've looked at the response to the consultation. On the whole, the balance we thought we struck at the time when we consulted was about right. So we've kind of kept that balance. But we intend to conduct a workshop with stakeholders within the next year after adoption of the guidelines, and see whether or not, as a result of that workshop, there's a need to or a demand to review and update them. So again, things are not always finished for all time, but after they're in force, we will look at reaction from stakeholders. In terms of the notification template, broadly speaking, provision of electronic communications networks or services, apart from the so-called number-independent interpersonal communication services, they can't be subject to anything other than a very general authorization. There can't be any specific licenses required, and so this is kind of a continuation of the existing arrangements under the current framework, more or less. But again, there's been a demand, I think, to have for two things to happen. One is for there to be a consistency in the kind of notification process and the information to be provided, and in particular then for the BEREC office to maintain a database of all the notifications received by NRAs. So the guidelines today are guidelines about what can be asked for in the notification process, and then during 2020 we will finalise the arrangements for the database. Then we are publishing a preliminary report on harmonised collection of data from authorised undertakings and from OTT operators. Leading up to this, we've done a number of interviews with people who might be asked to provide information. On the whole, the stakeholders we talk to they welcome the initiative, particularly stakeholders and operators who operate across multiple member states. They'd rather provide information once or provide it in the same form to different member states. There's certain concerns about confidentiality. There's certain difficulties about how things might be measured, particularly by OTT operators. And of course, different operators have different definitions, but if we're collecting data in a consistent basis, we'll need to have a kind of common data dictionary for that. It seems that the most important indicators are things like penetration, how many users there are, and also usage information, and then issues like revenue-related information and indicators of substitutability might also be useful, given the purposes of this, which is really to help both NRAs and other stakeholders understand markets and understand what the impact is. Are new services substitutable for traditional services and so forth? So as we move forward on this, just to let you know about the kind of work that is to come, we will have another questionnaire for providers to kind of understand a bit more about their capability to provide information, and then we will adopt a final report that's planned in plenary 3 of 2020. And then we will also organise a workshop about potential templates for data collection, and tentatively that's planned for November next year. And then in 2021, there's potential follow-on work where we maybe start having more guidelines on collection of data from OTTs. Okay. Let me talk about the study on determinants of investment in very high capacity networks. So this was a study which I think is probably the most comprehensive look at all the different drivers that there are. So some of them affect capital costs, some affect, we looked at the things that drive capital costs, the things that affect finance, some things that affect competition, wholesale access, and so forth. And each of these things affects certain aspects of the business case for investment. So it might affect the capex, it might affect the opex, it might affect the revenue, or it might affect the discount rate that's used for it. So we've tried to look at this. This kind of looks from the point of view of an operator considering investment. What will drive the case for yes or no in making that investment? And then the market model obviously then consists of many operators all making decisions based on the environment they're in. Thanks. So this is I'm probably not going to go through every loop on this diagram today, but you'll have the opportunity to study at leisure when the report comes out in a few days' time. But it shows essentially there are many factors involved, and lots of things affect one another, and the implications of this kind of complexity. And I think one of the things we'd say is it's important to recognize the complexity. If you oversimplify and leave out some of these dynamics, then you will end up thinking that a particular action taken by a regulator might have one effect, but you'll miss other indirect effects and the way that some of these things get amplified. So whilst when you're looking at a particular question, you may be able to look at a subset of this diagram, it's important to bear in mind that there are lots of interconnected drivers here. And in general terms, I'll go on to, in a minute, some of the key insights. One of the things that comes out of this is that one size does not fit all, which I think has been a BEREC theme for a long time. But when you look at why is it that, say, in Spain there's been reasonably high levels of fibre investment, in Sweden there's been relatively high levels, and in Ireland there hasn't yet been, you would see that the reasons why you have them in Sweden and the reasons why you have them in Spain are quite different, and it's not just a question of what the regulator did. In fact, what the regulator does is maybe one of the least important things. That some of the starting point of some things that are endogenous to the market, like do you have a lot of spare ducts, as you do in Spain, or do you have a lot of people who are willing to pay larger amounts of money than in other member states, as you do in Sweden? These things make a very big difference. So it's not the case that every regulator should just do the same thing and that will result in the same outcome. The individual characteristics of the market make a huge difference. And the other points to make are the ones I was kind of saying earlier. It's that there's a danger in being very simplistic about saying that if you do this, then if you do one thing, then the consequence will immediately follow, because a regulatory action ripples through that whole ecosystem, that whole system that we saw on the previous slide, and you take one action, it can affect incumbents in one way, it can affect new entrants in another way, it might increase the incentives for one type of operator and decrease the incentives for another type of operator. So these things, as I say, are not so straightforward. And the last thing I would say about this is investment isn't everything. Although it's part of the code, one of the objectives in the code is to promote investment and take up of very high capacity networks. Consumer welfare also depends on choice, on pricing, on innovation, and it's important not to lose sight of those other consumer welfare aspects. So some quick insights. One is that the deployment cost matters. So where it's cheap to deploy fibre networks, then you get more fibre networks. And so one thing that's important is to think about how to make it cheaper. So I think a particular insight comes out of this is that the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive, it's probably a good time to start looking at that again and seeing how can that be made more effective in reducing deployment costs. And then there are a whole lot of issues that are to do with local planning issues that also have a big impact. So one thing that comes out of the study is really to kind of take a good look at those issues. Another is that competition does in fact drive investment. We absolutely see that where we have a threat or the actuality of competition, whether it's from cable, whether it's from altnets, even sometimes from wireless, all of those things incentivize either incumbent investment to deal with a competitive threat, or the competitive threat comes along and customers get served by the new entrant. So that is a very important dynamic. Another thing that we see is that capital, the nature of the investors, are very important. So there certainly seems to be what we'd call patient capital, so infrastructure investors who are looking for a kind of relatively low risk, relatively low return, long time horizon investment, and that there is money wanting to invest on that basis. So it's very important again to think about the incentives for that type of investor coming into the market, and not necessarily, there are other types of investor who are looking for different risk reward profiles. Another thing is that the copper withdrawal is quite important. It affects the business case. So obviously, if you're an incumbent and you're investing in fibre and you're going to withdraw the copper, then you know that the take-up risk on fibre is quite low, because if there's no copper, there'll be a high take-up risk. You get high take-up of fibre. But then there's also questions about how would, if you call them virtual legacy services, be priced. If they, would you be permitted to base them on the fibre cost? How's that going to work? So those are, I think, unanswered questions, but they seem to be important questions in the in driving VHCN. And lastly, I think there's a question about access regulation. I think many of the things in the code talk about effectively lighter touch access regulation, or even being relieved of access obligations in certain circumstances, whether it's wholesale-only networks or co-investment or so forth. And obviously, there's a kind of question there about, are the competition angles being met? But I think one of the things we see is that this may not be the most important issue in driving investment. So of course, the code provisions are there, but we see a lot of people actually willing to invest in wholesale-only networks. So the model of providing access to all retailers seems to attract capital, but in that context, of course, the pricing issues around and how the long-term approach to pricing and how that affects risk may also be important. So I think the study itself gives some insights, raises some further questions, and so forth. What we've decided to do, it is a very complicated study, so we are going to spend a little bit of time digesting the study. We don't think it's timely to move on to a quantitative approach right now. So when Dan presents the work plan, you'll see that we've taken out the quantified approach of this at the moment. But there's certainly quite a lot to do to work out what the implications are. Okay, thank you. I'll now move to Teresa, please, and would you like to talk about Member States' best practices in supporting the definition of adequate broadband IaaS?
Yes, thanks, Jeremy. I suppose the basis of this is the new code and the Article 84, where BEREC shall draw up a report on Member States' best practices to support the defining of adequate broadband IAS. So that was the work that BEREC commenced in March, working closely with the Commission and taking into account any data that's currently available from the Commission, going back to reports that were done in 2011, 2014, looking at the DESI report and all other data. We issued questionnaires to all Member States, of which 9 Member States have broadband, and our report is based on our findings from those 9 Member States. So the report is set out with our policy principles, really referring to the legislative basis, the relevant experience being mainly the Commission reports and data that's available, the common principles with respect to bandwidth, evaluation, eligibility, designation mechanisms, QAS, monitoring affordability, and the nature of funding. And I suppose all those criteria were the criteria, they were the lens through which we looked at the broadband within each of the Member States. And we also have recommendations for future reports, because we're very cognizant that there is all broadband that's currently designated within the 9 Member States. It's under the Universal Service Directive, which doesn't have a mandate. So obviously in December 2020, at which stage the code will be transposed in all Member States, the Member States then will refer to the BEREC report, and they will actually define the adequate broadband IAS for services for their territories, with a view to ensuring the bandwidth necessary for social and economic participation in society. So with that, we laid out the report and we asked a number of specific questions. The first question is in relation to the criteria that we have defined, which is on the next slide, Tom. So Member States, what they took in force, so what we've sought is asking to rate importance. So we're inviting to know for all stakeholders, what do they deem is important in the definition of adequate broadband IAS. The discussion about all the topics are within the report, and I suppose what we're trying to do is we're trying to establish a list, because each Member State had a totally different approach. So that's our first question. Our second question then on the next slide is we're asking, are there any other relevant experiences or criteria that we should take into account that aren't already covered in the report? And the third question is with regard to views on the minimum bandwidth requirements of a connection at a fixed location to ensure consumers have sufficient bandwidth to guarantee social and economic participation in society. In the code in Annex 5, there's a list of minimum set of services, and those services are basic services like email, search engines, training, online newspapers, job searching, internet banking, e-government, social media. They're all listed in Annex 5. So what we're asking is, what are the views on the minimum bandwidth requirements of a connection with regard to that? In our findings, throughout the Member States, there was a range ranging from 1 megabit to 10 with regard to minimum download speeds. So again, throughout the 9 Member States, there's a range of speeds available. So moving then to question 4, what we've asked is, do you have any specific observations on eligibility, QAS and affordability? And I suppose why we've asked those and highlighted those 3 specific areas. With regard to eligibility, there is a range from limiting the scope of broadband to disabled end users, to where market failure occurs, to where there is no broadband service at an available price. So there was no real consistency throughout the Member States with regard to eligibility. With regard to QAS, again, 5 out of 9 Member States have introduced QAS measures specifically related to the USO. So again, we're asking for specific observations on QAS. And finally, on affordability measures, 6 member states introduced affordability measures, and again that's set out in the report. In 4 of those member states, affordability schemes apply to disabled end users. In 1 member state it applies to elderly and retired people, and in another member state it's based on pricing. So again, a wide range. So I suppose what we have is we have 9 member states that have some broadband mandated. We have been asked to do a report on best practices. We know that the code will only be transposed in member states by December 2020. So we're proposing that this is a first stage, that we will review this again, and when broadband is in place that we will do further work on it. We finally conclude with, do you have any general observations on this draft report? So we're inviting stakeholders to respond to us, and I think, Tom, the deadline is the 22nd of January. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. And I should have said at the beginning, we'll take, as usual, we'll go through the presentation and take questions at the end. If I can now invite Bo to give us an update on the call for inputs, or the report on the call for inputs on the impact of 5G on regulation and the role of regulation in enabling the 5G ecosystem. So, Bo.
Thank you, Jeremy. Good afternoon, everyone. Development of the 5G ecosystem involves many aspects of regulation, as you're clearly aware of. And our working group, we got the task to develop a report that aims to help us anticipate where and how 5G deployment may have an impact on the regulatory environment, and also vice versa, how the regulatory environment may impact the 5G deployment. And as Jeremy mentioned in the beginning, we started out to seek to identify specific problems, but really not to come up with solutions right away. I mean, 5G is still very new, and we sought to undertake, as we could call it, a horizon scanning exercise, and while doing that, posing a series of questions. I mean, how services might be rolled out, how markets might be developing, how any of these might raise new regulatory challenges for NRAs. And of course, this is not something we can do on our own. We tried to, and we're, I think, fortunate to be able to, and you could wait a little bit, to involve stakeholders at an early stage. So we had a call for inputs this summer, and we got more than 40 responses, and they came from many different areas and many different organizations and different types of stakeholders. And I think this was really good for us. Of course, it also proposed a challenge for us, because it was a lot of material to dig through. I mean, we got a lot of responses that we're very thankful for and gives us a lot of input, but we also need to, of course, take it in carefully, because we have a lot of work from you, stakeholders, sending this in to us. And then we could start to the first slide here. This next slide, please. Because it's one interesting observation here is that it seems quite clear to us that we are thinking in the same areas. Stakeholders, you raise issues and questions around areas that we think are important as well. And if you could just list a few examples here, the new technology developed through 5G, it raises a lot of possibilities. You have new possibilities for new business models, and this might have an impact on value change and new areas like network slicing, and this in connection with net neutrality is something that raised a lot of interest. To be able to develop and use new business models, you need to have a rollout. You need to have the system in place. And in this area, the whole planning exercise in this, you need backhaul. We need to have coverage to get the services everywhere. You need a lot of maybe densification of the base stations. You have small cell issues here that come up, and this, of course, is a cost issue to have a lot of new investments here. So infrastructure sharing is important, and you have a lot of connected items. Numbering here comes up, and I should also at this time, I think, Jeremy, post that we are interested in getting responses on. There's an ongoing consultation on numbering as well that is referenced in our report that you can see, and so we'd like to just highlight that at this time. There are also other aspects going further that, I mean, when you have the infrastructure in place and the new business models, there you have the users, end users, both from the consumer side and also the new area verticals that need, of course, the concern of quality of service going into this. And you need consumer information in place in good ways. And also, of course, interoperability also is an area where there are a lot of concerns. And in addition, just to make this picture even fuller, you have privacy, security issues, and also access to spectrum as one really important part here. And one of the things we see there that some of these issues are currently being looked at in other BEREC working groups. I mean, as I said, we are not solving the issues in this report. We were identifying and looking forward how to go forward. And we see that some of them are included in ongoing activities or this year or next year or the year after. So we're going in that direction. And if we move forward to the next slide. How do we then continue with this? And because it's also clear that of all the answers, there are a lot of, or maybe a lot, but a few stakeholder comments that are not within BEREC's remit to deal with. And there are also comments that things we should not deal with, suggestions. But we also see that those different remits that those comments. Sorry about that. I got a little bit confused where I was here. They're addressed by other competent authorities, either now or in the future. And examples of this are studies on emission levels of electromagnetic radiation, and also the development of a toolkit for dealing with network security issues, for those examples of that. And it's, I said in the beginning, that when 5G is developing and still everything is not in place, and this is also means that we see that some of the concerns cannot really be addressed at this moment. So we really need to continue this survey mode that we are in BEREC, and then try to move on to getting a grip of what these changes may mean and how they affect the regulatory environment as they start to appear. So it's still, I mean, really would like to continue this good dialogue that we now have with you, and we are, as I said, very thankful for the responses. And this report now is the first step. This is a response report on your input, and it's the first step for BEREC to achieve the objective of identifying and tracking relevant issues here. And we plan then to continue to work with this. We invite you to comment on if you see something missing, or and also if you would like to prioritize, point out what you think is most important, or what is not so important right now, or maybe later on in the future. Because this is what the steps that we are going to take. We will go deeper into this, prioritize, and also identify issues and how to move forward with this. And this we plan to publish in a new report after plenary 2 next year for public consultation, and then with the final report by the end of the year. So with that, I conclude my presentation, part of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bo. I now ask Dan to give an update on the work programme for 2020. Dan.
Thank you. Good afternoon also from me. So if we move to the first slide, thank you. I'm going to first say a few words about the public consultation we've had on the work programme, where many of you have assisted us. So thank you very much for those inputs. They are very important to us. One of the expected and very important input is, of course, the first bullet point here, that we should not forget to focus on our core and mandatory work. I think there's no risk of doing that, but there is a certain movement where BEREC is, I think, being asked to participate in many areas, and the presentation that Bo just made is just showing one of those complexities that we see all the time. We have looked at the comments we received. I think we had 18 submissions during the consultation on the work programme, and they help us a lot in prioritizing and shaping the programme. They have not led to any new work items proposed, but we have amended a little bit here and there where appropriate timing and scope of work items. I will just comment a little bit on some of them. You see them there on the screen. On 5G, I think we have been asked to clarify what are we going to be doing, and you just heard Bo saying a number of things that comes from that Pathfinder exercise. There is a lot of work to be done, and we'll need to continue the thinking and prioritize where we can have the best value for money in our efforts. We can perhaps not be everywhere at the same time. On security, which is in many instances during the last year and probably moving forward very much linked to the 5G exercise, we are already aware, and we were told again not to seek to overstep our mandate. We are not really bidding for new work. We have plenty of work, and we don't want to confuse our role with the role of other agencies in the field, like ENISA and the NIS group. But we also think that we feel support for continued dialogue with you stakeholders, but also with other agencies. I think there is a role for us to continue with that. And we together with all of you, I think, are keenly looking forward to the toolbox presentations from the Commission towards the end of the year or the beginning of next, whatever is the foreseen deliverable there, which may inform a little bit more what BEREC will be asked to do and what we can reasonably assist with as we go forward. On VHCN, we notice that many are keenly awaiting the guidelines that's foreseen for consultation after P2 next year, so please keep your eyes open for that. For the study, as Jeremy mentioned, we have sort of paused a little bit the quantitative stage, so that is not appearing in the work program as a work item. On digital platforms, I will speak a little bit more in a minute, but I think generally this is an item, again, one of the items where BEREC is a little bit asked and perhaps also seeks on its own initiative to widen its scope a little bit. This is discussed a lot, and many organizations and groups are working in the field, and I think BEREC needs to do some work there as well, and we are going to be doing that next year. I'll come back to that in a moment. And finally, on, of course, stakeholder engagement, we are happy to hear that those that responded to this consultation are keen to be consulted again, and we'll continue with the move to more transparency and more dialogue with all our stakeholders. That's the direction we're going. So if I can have the next slide, there it is. So I was very happy last week to have the final work program of 2020 adopted by the Board of Regulators. It's been a long journey. We set out, I think, in March preparing the work program, and it's been a lot of activities getting it finally adopted and in place. So that's a relief. Now we just need to get on with it and do what we say we should do. I believe the final document is being uploaded on BERECnet today. So if you're... Just done. It's just done, Tom says. That's perfect. So you can go home and you can study it in all the detail. We will be quite busy. You see there the number of things we are putting in there. I think the total number of deliverables is somewhere just above 40, and I think that's more or less as in previous years. It covers a lot of topics, roaming, 5G, access regulation, numbering, end users, security, just to name a few. Out of the 12 workshops, I can tell you that 7 are foreseen to be open for external participation. And then we, of course, foresee that there will be ad hoc work coming our way from the newly started Commission and Parliament. So we are a little bit preparing for doing a few extra items. I should mention also that we are, if you are looking at the work program and you miss the ad hoc communication group, it's not because we have stopped working with communication, it's because we have shifted that to an expert networking group, I think is the term, under the BEREC office. You will find it in connection to that work program, and we're actually starting a second such group on sustainability issues, which I think is another area where BEREC needs to, along with the rest of society, look at how we can contribute more positively. Final slide from me. I said I would come back to platforms. We are foreseeing 2 work streams on digital platforms, and one is a study, which the terms of reference are being prepared by some experts now, and it will be a procurement exercise by the BEREC office beginning of next year. And the idea is to have a sort of study on the attitudes and perception of consumer behavior towards digital consumer platforms, because we feel we need to understand that a little bit more, and so that's a little bit the B2C kind of perspective on platforms. And then we're doing some internal work along with this, an internal work stream where we focus more on the potential bottlenecks and competition concerns from a more B2B perspective, perhaps. So I think that those 2 work streams together will give us a better base to continue to think about what might be the role of BEREC as we go forward in discussing the need for maybe more regulation in this area, and the relationship between ex ante and ex post regulation, which is being discussed in many other places. I'm sure you're aware of all that. The study will I think finish only in 2021, so this is sort of preparing for having a better basis for taking positions in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. I will just wrap up. I think a couple of things to say. I think this is my last public engagement as BEREC Chair, but it's not the last thing I have to do, because I think we have, Dan reminded me with talking about the expert networking groups, there's a single programming document for the BEREC office, which has to be published by the end of the year. So that will be, I think, voted on by electronic clearance probably on Christmas Day, and will be published on St. Stephen's Day, or no doubt, or possibly on different days for you, in case you're getting bored of your families by then. I also wanted just to say, of course, the planning never ends, I think. So just to highlight that, although we've just adopted the 2020 work programme, the work on both the medium-term strategy and the 2021 work programme begins almost immediately. So thank you very much for the responses to the call for input that was accompanied the consultation on the 2020 work programme. That was also a call for input on the medium-term strategy. We had a very good orientation discussion at the last plenary on that, and the plan is there'll be a public consultation in March next year after P1 on the medium-term strategy, and at the same time there'll be an early call for inputs for the 2021 work programme. And then also to just give a kind of advertisement for the Stakeholder Forum. So this year we're moving it forward to the 1st of April, and that is so that it can be used to give for stakeholders to have an input into the medium-term strategy and into the future work programme at an earlier stage through that process. And we are also envisaging a format which we're calling, we refer to ourselves as speed dating, so an opportunity for stakeholders, so not just the representative groups, but potentially individual members who wish to engage with co-chairs, to have an opportunity to have short meetings to draw their attention to matters that they think that are particularly on your agenda, and to ask them questions as well. So that is something to foresee for next year. And then just a reminder on the public consultation. So we have two things we're publishing for public consultation today. One of them is the guidelines on public warning systems. That's due to close on the 31st of January. So that's, I think, 2 weeks later than the minimum 6 weeks, to reflect particularly the Christmas holidays. And the second is on the draft report that Teresa talked about. And again, that is closing on the 22nd of January, so we're staggering it a little bit for you. But particularly, I think we envisage a further discussion on that topic at our first plenary, which is why we've made that one a little bit earlier.
Registration for the Stakeholder Forum is open.
And I'm asked to say, registration for the Stakeholder Forum is already open. So if you need a last-minute Christmas present for somebody, that would be ideal. And that's the end of the presentation, and I open the floor for questions. And I think people who are participating remotely may not be able to hear the questions because of the setup of the room, but don't worry, I'll repeat the question before answering it. So can I open the floor, please? So I think there are two questions from the representative from Telefonica. The first question was, how did we choose who to engage with on the topic of data collection from OTTs and authorized operators? So what I would say is this was kind of this is really a very early stage. We're trying to what's the word? Scope out what are some of the issues. So this was not intended to be by any means a full public consultation. So I think it was really, in this case, going to talk to some people we don't normally talk to, and find out what they think about these issues, and in particular people who were obviously significant providers of services in Europe. So there wasn't great science about it, and of course it was a preliminary information gathering step, and there'll be more formal public consultations where all stakeholders will get the opportunity to respond. I think in the question of why do the study, I think it was partly it's a response to the question of VHCN being in the code. So there's an obligation on member states, on BEREC, on NRAs, on the Commission, on everybody to look at the how to promote investment and take up of VHCNs. And in some ways, I'm quite glad you say that everything is obvious, because I think that, when you look at the kind of debates there have been during the code, and when you look at, and then that of course is now behind us, the code is behind us, but to kind of understand how these things fit together, and actually it is often the case you do these studies and then the conclusions you reach from them, it's good that they seem self-evident, but they're often not self-evident in the cut and thrust of debate. And I think it also helps motivate some next steps. So, for example, for me, the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive was there. It's been, I would say, relatively unimpactful. But I think what this study really, for me, motivates is to say, well, actually, it could make a huge difference to the rollout of VHCNs in some markets if that Broadband Cost Reduction Directive was changed in a way that made it really much simpler and cost-effective and practical for people seeking access to civil engineering infrastructure to get it. And that, I think, has been, will be one of the things we want to interact with DG Connect about with the new commissioner. We'll be saying that actually that's really should be quite a high priority for you. And what's more, because of the importance, when you look at it, it's a directive which at the moment kind of works on, it's quite light touch and works on resolving disputes if disputes arise, but in practice people generally that's too uncertain a route to be of any use to people. So if the objective of opening up that infrastructure to make it easier to use requires more intrusive powers, then I think the particular importance of that to in the system is something that can potentially motivate that, and if the commission takes that up and they have to do an impact assessment, then I think the dynamics that are identified here will be a very useful input into that impact assessment. So it's not intended as a kind of, I'd say, a specific, in answer to your question, a specific piece of lobbying to make a particular point. It's there to provide in one place, a kind of comprehensive inventory of the dynamics that can then be used when assessing particular suggestions in the future. Okay, so the question from Elizabeth from the FTTH Council was to ask about the working group on sustainability, and I'll ask Dan to talk about that.
Well, thank you. No, I think it's not really planned yet. I think we are at the very early stages. This is something that came up when we had the first meeting of the mini board for next year, maybe 6 weeks ago, and we said that we should have a work stream on sustainability, and then we discussed a little bit how to do that, and we said it would be one of these expert networking groups under the BEREC office, and we are still, I think, in the founding stages of putting the work together. And I suppose the first thing to do is to have a little bit of a scoping discussion. What could it be? So that would be the first task for the volunteers for the group to do that. And we are, of course, happy to take suggestions from stakeholders in the meantime about what you think we should be doing. I noticed that yesterday at the conference, the ECTA conference, there was a panel on sustainability in the sector, and I think we are seeing more and more of the discussion that the sector wants to be involved in and seen to be involved in tackling the sustainability issue. So I think good suggestions are always welcome.
Thank you. So the question from representative from Public Safety Europe was about the work on public warning systems, and two questions really. One was, do we envisage having a workshop with the competent authorities involved in this area? And secondly, do we see any longer term role for BEREC? So I think in answer to the first question, I think we absolutely recognise that the stakeholders on this area are not the usual suspects for BEREC, and that of course it's easy enough for us to get responses and engagement from our usual stakeholders. So we appreciate the importance of engaging with that community, and the working group is considering what are the best ways. So I won't absolutely commit them to a workshop, but we realise, but there has to be what's the word? Effective engagement with that community, and we will make sure that happens. As for the longer-term involvement in BEREC, this was a specific task that the co-legislators gave BEREC in the code. So, of course, it's always possible that the Commission can always ask BEREC for opinions on matters, or there can be further legislation. But I think we probably wouldn't envisage taking an initiative in this area, but we're always willing to put our expertise at the disposal of any institutions that feel it would be useful to them. I'll just check if there are any remote questions, if there are no more questions in the room. No, I'm getting shaking heads that we have no remote questions. So look, just before I close, I'd said at the last BEREC plenary that the last year as BEREC Chair has been one of the most enjoyable and satisfying of my professional experience, and one of the reasons for that has been the engagement with the stakeholders. So I really want to thank everybody in this room and other stakeholders for the support they've given, for the engagement with BEREC. I hope you feel that we've been as transparent and helpful as we can be to you. You're certainly very important to us, and so many thanks to you. And again, I would also like to pay tribute to Dan. As you will have seen, really 2019 and 2020 is a joint venture between PTS and ComReg. It's a bit of a coincidence, actually, that our two co-chairs who are presenting today are also from PTS and ComReg, but so many of the projects start in 2019 and get finished in 2020, and Dan has been a superb vice chair, and he will be a very good chair as well, and thank you very much, Dan, for that as well. And thank you all. Thank you.